Welcome to your online Learn to Paint class. Today we're going to be looking at creating a spring blossom. This one in particular is a picture that I took of a cherry tree in early spring. I actually was fortunate. I took the picture I think 2 years ago because, as you know, we are all sort of restricted from moving around right now. So here I am, and the first thing I like to do is sketch out the image. Sometimes I'll use a pencil to do that. Today I'm actually just using a little bit of white paint and a medium-sized brush, and I'm just finding the edges of the main image that I want to paint. I like to position it a little bit off-center. I find when you put things dead smack in the middle, it's not quite as interesting as something that's off to the side a little bit. However, that is definitely up to you how you want to set this up. As you know, if you've watched any of my previous workshops, when we do the sketching part, we're not sketching any of the details. What we're doing is we're looking at the image and we're finding the large shapes. So in this case, the large shapes would be first the major outline shape of the blossom itself, and then this next smallest shape would be the individual petals of the flower. The next step, once I have the large shapes in, I like to find my highlight areas where the light is hitting the object in the brightest areas. And those I use a lemon yellow, which I mix with a little bit of white to brighten it up even further. And I fill those areas in. There's no specific technique at this point. I'm not painting as if I'm painting a wall. I'm basically very lightly going through and finding those light and bright areas that I want to highlight. Once I'm happy with the lightest areas, I'm going to start laying down some of the mid-tone areas. And as I said at the very beginning, all you're doing is basically blocking in. And what that means is you're selecting a value, which is the lightness or darkness of a color, and you're filling in that shape with the corresponding value. So right now, as you can see, the value that I'm using is slightly darker than the light area that we put in earlier. I'm just looking at my reference image and I'm comparing it to what I have on my canvas, and I'm filling in those mid-tone areas. Mixed up a slightly darker color again, and now I'm looking for the matching value areas. So I've got a bit of a darker color. And as you can see, the image that we're using is pretty much white and shades of white, which is really, really difficult, especially for beginners to pull off. So what I've done in this particular workshop is I've decided to use some color rather than the white to represent these areas, which will make it a lot easier for you to determine which areas are lighter, which areas are darker. So now we're starting to build in some of the shadow areas, which are the darkest areas that you'll find in this particular image. And these are areas where, of course, the light doesn't reach as well. This particular petal is sort of folded over on itself. As you can see, the top area is kind of folded in. And so there's light there on the top area, and then underneath it's darker. So I'm mixing up. I've used a little bit of my umber color, a little bit of my blue, and then a little bit of white. What the blue does to your umber is it cools it down. So it's great for shadows. And it makes things darker. Just working on the very darkest areas right now with that color that we mixed. Of course, because I'm using oil paints, everything stays wet. The paint stays wet quite a long time on the canvas. And so I can blend and work with the paint very easily. If you're using acrylics, as long as your paint is still wet, you'll be able to layer and blend right over top. If your paint has dried, you can do similar ideas. You'll just have to work on thinning out the color so that it's sort of a translucent when it lays over top of another color. If you've never tried oils, I encourage you to do so. There is a misconception out there that oils are bad for you, that they're harmful, etc., etc. That is absolutely false. What is harmful for you are the mediums and the solvents that are used in both oil and in acrylic painting. Those solvents, if you ever read the labels, they contain some pretty harmful stuff. And I don't recommend that you use those, especially in a closed environment. There's a lot of fumes that come off of those. So I don't use any of those. I don't use Varsol, Taltine, any of that harmful stuff for cleaning up. I clean up my brushes actually with dish detergent. And when I want to thin out my oil paint, because as you know, oil paint is quite thick, when I want to thin it out, I use a pure paint oil, which is, I use the walnut oil. You can also use linseed oil, but you will find linseed oil does have a stronger smell. That's why I use the walnut oil, because it's very, very mild smell to it. And I like it as well. It's super shiny, so it really makes the colors pop really nicely. And you can mix walnut oil with linseed oil paints, or linseed oil with walnut oil paints, vice versa. There's no harm in doing that. So we're getting to the point now, we're kind of working in some of the details and softening some of the edges that are in between our medium area of values and our lighter area of values. And again, I've got a white on my brush, but it's not a pure white. I've mixed in a little bit of the yellow and a tiny little bit of the brown to give us a very light gray. You'll notice when I use my brush, I tend to move the brush along the contour of the object that I'm painting. So in this case, the petal has a curvature to it that slopes down and to the left, and so my brush stroke is following that curve. And I find when I do that, that it really defines the shape of the object. So we're mixing up a fair bit of the blues and white, and I'm using a cobalt to get a translucent effect. So we want it to be very soft and translucent feeling, because that's the way these petals are. If you ever look at flower petals, they're not like tree bark or a solid object. Light, if you hold it up to the light, you can see the light passing through it. And that's basically because a flower petal, just like any organic matter, is made up of molecules, and there's space in between those molecules. And so the light passes through, and it gives it that nice translucent feel. In reality, there really are no harsh edges on these blossoms. Everything is soft and airy. However, if we do want to give the impression of a form, we do need to have some shapes and some edges in our painting. So what I'm basically doing here is I'm going through, I put a hard edge in, and then as you can see, I'm taking that same brush and I'm pushing it out to soften that edge. So it's still there because that dark area does indicate an indented area, an edge, but because I've softened it now, it is not so prominent. On this side over here, I've added a little bit of red to my brush. Again, it's very soft color. It's almost the same color as the ground of my canvas. And that's just to add in a little bit of contrast. We have a lot of cool colors going on with the blues and the darker yellows. We've got a little bit of red to warm things up, but it's still a cool red. It's not a brilliant hot red. Because we've softened it down, it's very pinkish. If you watch other videos and you listen to other artists talk about their methods and what they're doing as they paint, you'll often hear us talk about pushing and pulling the paint. And if you're never painted before, especially if you've never painted with oil paints before, it's hard to really know what that means until you actually start doing it. Basically, it's the process of taking paint that's already on the canvas and pushing that paint across the canvas and pulling it into other areas. And you can see as you do that on the canvas that the paint takes on a different character. And especially now, you see how I just added some blue into that red? So that changed everything. And now all of a sudden that red area, which was kind of just a big red blob, suddenly it has form because now it has a darker edge to the right and a lighter edge to the left area. So now you can actually see that it's curving around rather than just being a flat shape. I think for me, when I'm oil painting, it's the pushing and pulling of the paint that's really the most fun. The early stages of putting in paint on a canvas, it's a little bit cumbersome because you're kind of just covering up the canvas. You're marking in the large areas, but even so, it's still very important because you want to make sure you've got composition laid out properly, you've got your shapes in properly. The fun stuff begins once all that is in there and you can start pushing and pulling and moving that painting around. I'm just going to add some highlights here on the top to get some light coming into this area. I always love watching these videos after I've done the painting because then I can see how things just transform before my eyes. When you're involved in the painting process, sometimes you don't see what you're doing as having an effect. That's why it's great when you're doing these videos, and that's the advantage of having these pre-recorded videos, is you can stop the video. If you feel like you're getting stuck, I always recommend people just stop, put the paints away, and come back the next day fresh and go at it again. So I've started to add a warmer red area here, which gives us a really nice contrast to the cool blue that is opposite on the canvas. These areas here that I'm working on at the top of the canvas are actually petals from another blossom that is adjacent to this one. You don't have to put these in. I just wanted to put something in to show a kind of a placement of that blossom. I didn't really want it floating in space. I could have instead put some branches in behind and some of the closed blossoms that haven't opened yet. If you look at your reference image, there are a lot of choices in that reference image that you can use. You can move things around. You don't have to paint things exactly as you see in your reference image. You can move things around and change colors, change shapes. Basically, it is what it is. It's a reference image, which means it's just something that you can refer to help you figure out where things should go as far as what the flower looks like and how it's formed. But as far as the composition itself, certainly play with that composition and try a different way of placing it on the canvas. Just putting in a little bit of the green in the background. A lot of this is going to get faded out because I want the blossom to be the main character in our story. Certainly, if your preference is to simply just cover in that entire background in a solid color, you can do that too. I encourage you to try using the same image but in different ways. It's always a lot of fun to try new things, try different methods. I talk about quite a bit with my students about being brave. And I believe that when you're brave with your art practice, which is something that's so easy to be brave in because it's not life-threatening whatsoever, that when you get into real life, you can take that bravery, you can take that confidence that you've learned from creating a piece of artwork into your everyday life. If there's something that you always wanted to try, someplace you always wanted to go, and you were always afraid to do that, being brave with your artwork will help you find that courage. just going back in and darkening up some of those dark areas. I like to have some contrast in my work. I find putting a really light area beside a really dark area gives you some drama and contrast in the artwork. Makes it more interesting to look at. And sometimes you don't know how dark you need to go. So oftentimes it's closer to the end where artists will talk about going in and redefining their lights and their darks. So now we've grabbed a fair bit of paint on our brush. We've got some white, some off-white. It's very thick, and I like to do this to add texture. And that's one of the great advantages of using oil paints, is because of its nice heavy texture of the paint itself. You can do this very easily with oil paint and add in some nice texture. So when this dries, some of these areas you'll be able to touch and feel will be feeling all kind of bumpy, and they'll stick out from the canvas. And the nice thing about that is when you hang this, the areas that are sticking out are going to catch the light, and they're also going to cast shadows. So it adds that little bit extra. And I've got paintings that I hang in my living room, and the light, of course, it moves around from morning to evening. And so in the morning, a certain painting will look a certain way, but then in the evening, the light's going to hit it differently, and it will look different. And it's really neat to see that and to witness that. And it's not something that happens when you're just hanging up a piece of work from IKEA or something like that, because that's just a printed a printed picture in a frame, and most times they have the glass frame, and so it doesn't really allow the light to get into that picture, and it's flat as well. So when you've got real oil paint or a real acrylic painting hanging on the wall, and it's got some body to it and thickness, when the light hits it in different times of the day, it's really remarkable at the different ways that it looks. We're just filling in the background, and the background is very abstract at this point. My star of this particular story that I'm creating is that cherry blossom, and so everything else on the canvas is really secondary to that. So I want the background to basically, it's going to complement that blossom. As you can see, it's same color palette. We haven't changed colors drastically, but it is considerably darker, and I'm allowing some of those edges to be very, very sharp and crisp, the ones that are closest to the viewer. And then these ones here in the back, I'm going to go back in later and blur those petal edges that are further back into the background a little bit. And what that does is it creates depth overall in the painting. So we're just basically working on the background and filling that in. And you don't, again, like I said, you don't want it too complicated. Our front area is fairly complicated already. If you complicate everything in the painting, the viewer gets tired. They don't know where to look anymore, and they're just going to move on. So we really want to try and simplify areas as much as we can. So in here you can see how I'm softening some of those petals edges in order to show some things that are closer, some things that are farther. Things that are farther away are softer edges. They have softer edges, they're more blurred out, and they have less detail and definition. Things that are closer to you have hard edges, lots of detail, and tend to be larger and more distinct in color. So I'm just using, this is a dry brushing sort of technique. The paint here is still wet, but I've used a fresh brush, and I just keep wiping it off as paint builds up on it, because I just basically am softening those edges. I'm just smoothing them out. Again, it's another push and pull sort of idea, except in a much softer way. These last little areas and little bits that we do on the artwork are just kind of refining areas. I don't want to have too many areas, like I said before, that are really sharp edges. Your focal point, which is the area that you want the viewer to notice first, should always be the area with the most contrast, with the where the lightest area on your painting meets the darkest area, which is where my brush is right now. So that would be your focal point, and then it should also have the sharpest edges and the most detail, of course. So I'm just refining that area a little bit. I've decided to use my palette knife at this point, same as I did earlier with the heavy application of paint, but instead of using a brush, I'm using the palette knife. And you can use a palette knife or you can use a brush, whichever tool you're most comfortable with. Sometimes it takes a little while to get used to using the palette knife as a painting tool. A lot of times painters will only use them for actually mixing colors. Again, there's no right or wrong, it's whatever you're most comfortable with. But if you do want to get good at using the palette knife, it's something that you need to practice. And in order to practice, of course, you need to use it. So don't be afraid to pick up that palette knife and give it a try. we're coming to the end here. Just a few final touches. I want to thank you for joining me again today, and I hope you enjoy your painting experience. Thanks so much.